The Sentry is the most terrifying superhero in the Marvel Universe. All the heroes and villains are afraid of this guy, and it makes sense. He broke every bone in the Incredible Hulk's body, he destroyed Asgard, he killed his own sidekick. Hell's bells, he even hit his dog. Not even the critters are safe from the Sentry in the Marvel Universe. So who even is this guy? And how in the world did a superhero become so terrifying? So the Sentry's real name is Robert Reynolds, and his story goes back to Captain America. So after Steve Rogers was presumed dead in World War II, the US and Canada launched Project Sentry, trying to make a new version of the super soldier serum that was 100,000 times more powerful than the original. Now, nobody really knew what it would do to the person that took it, and everybody just seemed to believe that it would make the person 100,000 times more powerful than Steve Rogers. But over time, Project Sentry was outsourced to various contractors, and the belief was that with so many people working on it, somebody would end up creating something that was insanely overpowered. And they did. In 1977, some unnamed professor had developed a perfected version called the Golden Century Serum. And so Bob Reynolds and a junkie friend of his break into the professor's office in the middle of a drug-induced haze, and they just take the serum, hoping to get a better high. Instead, he gets these insane solar-based powers of immortality, matter manipulation, resurrection, invulnerability, insane levels of strength. He's basically godlike. And so security shows up right when Reynolds' powers activate, and he blows the whole building apart, killing his friend. Now, the government learns about what's going on, and they bury the project. All the samples are destroyed, except for the ones the professor hid, and for a while, he starts injecting the Sentry with doses of the serum until his body can adapt to it. So what happens when you give a perfected super soldier serum to a drug addict with mental illness? Well, if you said the guy's life becomes this downward spiral where he systematically kills everybody in existence, you are so cynical, right? The guy turns his life around. He gets his mental health under control, he goes out into the world as a superhero, he becomes a symbol of optimism. In fact, he becomes a superhero before the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man or anybody else, and he's the reason they were inspired to become superheroes in the first place. He has a tower attached to the top of Avengers Tower, he marries a woman named Lindy, he's got a sidekick named Scout, a dog named Watchdog. Everybody in the world loves him, the guy's life is awesome. Until it's not, because you were right the first time. So it turns out that Sentry's arch nemesis is what he calls the Void. And for some reason the Sentry can't figure out, the Void is always a step ahead. Not only that, the Void is an absolute monster. On one night in particular, in the span of a few hours, the Void attacks Scout, destroying his face and blowing his arm off. Then he breaks every bone in the Hulk's body and traumatizes him so bad that the Void becomes the only thing he fears. Then the Void blows up Manhattan, killing 1 million people in the process. Buildings are smashed, bridges are destroyed, it's complete chaos. It's like the whole city was hit with a nuke, because the Void is the physical manifestation of all of Robert Reynolds' insecurities, fears, and depression. But it's also the part of him that loves to kill, the part that wants to be a bad guy. It has no inhibitions, and it has no moral code. It's the darkest part of himself. It's just pure, uncontrollable chaos with godlike power willed into existence by Robert Reynolds. Now, the Fantastic Four are the first ones to figure it out. They get to the scene after Manhattan's destruction and find Robert Reynolds just laying there as the Void. So once everybody realized what was going on, it was obvious that there was no way to defeat a being of such extreme power. So all the superheroes sweep the whole thing under the rug, so no one in the world knows that the Sentry and the Void are the same person. And then once Reynolds returns to normal, Reed Richards, Doctor Strange, and Reynolds himself make a device that blocks the world's knowledge of the Sentry and the Void, including Robert Reynolds, because if Reynolds never became the Sentry again, then the Void would never return. But he does. So Robert Reynolds wakes up in the middle of the night one night. It's this really weird moment where he's talking about how the Void's coming back. He grabs a bottle out of a book and then starts talking about the hero he used to be and how his special medicine makes him more powerful, but he's not really sure if what he remembers actually happened. His dog turns into the Void and then starts taunting him. So he freaks out, he attacks the dog. Lindy wakes up, she sees the bottle in one hand, the dog lying on the floor, and she thinks Bob's relapsed into alcoholism again, so she leaves him. He doesn't really know what to believe. Was he really the Sentry? Did the Sentry ever actually exist? Did the Void exist? Or was it all made up? Was it just his schizophrenia? And was his special medicine just like drugs? So Reynolds starts traveling around to all the superheroes, hoping they'll fill in the gaps in his own memory. And we're talking Spider-Man, the Hulk, the Fantastic Four, Doctor Strange, and the X-Men. But again, no one aside from the Hulk remembers him. Then he goes to the Sentry Tower and finds the device that's blocking everybody's memories, but he doesn't know what it is. So of course, he turns it off. Suddenly, everyone's memories come flooding back. The problem is that with everyone remembering the Sentry, they also remember the Void, which means the Void comes back at full power. Now, all the superheroes meet up to confront this guy. The Sentry goes off to fight him, but reality itself starts to distort because of the power these two are letting off. So everybody realizes there's no way the Sentry can win. I mean, the Void is the Sentry, so the only way Reynolds could possibly win is to die. But he's immortal, so the Void will always exist. The only option they have is to turn the device back on and then make everybody forget again. The end, right? Close story. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace. Wrong, because where we go from here is madness to downright chaos. So Reynolds suddenly shows up in the raft, having turned himself in, believing he's killed his wife, but helping to take out all the villains when Electro takes down power to the prison. Now, most of the heroes don't really seem to realize he's there because of all the chaos and the fighting, but the new Avengers have a list of everybody who was locked up and all the information on their powers and abilities and so on. So while they're out recapturing all these different villains who escaped, they eventually find Reynolds hiding out in a cave. The problem is they've never heard of this guy. Nobody has. And that's where you find out what's actually going on here. So the Avengers explain that his wife is alive, that he's just a regular guy named Bob Reynolds. As far as his wife knows, he just took off one day, and the only record in the world of a superhero called the Sentry exists in a comic book. There's no secret tower on top of Avengers Mansion. There's no history of 1 million people being obliterated in Manhattan. None of it's real. They even bring in Paul Jenkins, the guy who wrote the comic. Of course, Robert has a panic attack and then takes off to the only place he can think to go. Home. So the new Avengers, Fantastic Four, and the X-Men follow him. Now, I don't know that I'd consider it a good idea to harass a schizophrenic god, but they did. And when they confront him with all this information, the most logical outcome ensues. The guy freaks. The Void manifests and crushes everybody within seconds, and it literally all comes down to Emma Frost and her telepathy, who figures out that one of Sentry's enemies, known as the General, had reached out to Mastermind, a mutant who can control the 5 senses, and basically brainwashed Reynolds into believing that if he used his powers, or if anybody remembered him, he would literally create the devil, and that was the Void. Not only that, as part of this brainwashing, Mastermind and the General had forced the Sentry to wipe his and everyone else's minds of his own existence. So basically, the only part of his story that was true was the story of how he got his powers in the professor's lab. Everything else was stolen from a comic book. He quite literally altered reality to make the comic story into his own story. So he doesn't really know his own story. The cool thing, though, is that outside of Reed Richards, Lindy, and a few other people, everybody was allowed to forget that he had ever been a superhero in the first place, which essentially meant pressing the restart button on his life. So he did what pretty much all the other screwed up superheroes like Hulk, Wolverine, and Iron Man have done over the years. He joined the Avengers. Well, technically it was the Mighty Avengers, but don't misunderstand, right? Yes, he's powerful, but no one invited him onto the team strictly for that. The guy's a demigod with a broken mind. The Avengers just wanted to keep an eye on him, but at the same time, no one knew what this guy's triggers were. Nobody knew if he was just going to wake up on the wrong side of the bed one day, realize he was all out of coffee creamer, and just snap and destroy everything in existence. That never happened. Instead, for a while, things were pretty good. Most of the time was spent getting his mental health under control. He gets a therapist named Cornelius Worth, where he talks about the Void, he works through his history and the struggles of being a superhero with his wife Lindy, all while adapting to this new life, using enough of his powers to operate as a hero while trying to keep the Void from taking over. In fact, there comes a point when he locks the Void away in a vault inside Sentry Tower. It's this insanely secure place, but it's also one of the most interesting aspects of this time of his life, because he starts meeting with the Void at the request of his therapist in order to better understand this darker part of himself. And there's some cool questions that go on here. For example, the Void asked the question that if Robert Reynolds is the baseline personality and the Sentry is his heroic side and the Void is his villain side, is Robert Reynolds a hero or a villain. After all, he was a drug addict willing to steal from anyone for a hit, and that doesn't just change overnight. So what if the Sentry serum just exacerbated his villainous tendencies, and the Sentry is what little guilt he feels for it? Hence the reason why the Void is far more powerful than the Sentry. Now, the Sentry did try to destroy the Void a couple times, but as the darker part of himself, these were more superficial acts, because nobody can ever really destroy their darker sides. Now, I don't want to paint this picture that the Sentry never really did anything outside of working on himself. He was on Iron Man's Mighty Avengers team because he believed that registering superheroes was better than unregistered superheroes going down some kind of path that would lead to a war against humanity. He was fairly new to the whole team-based superhero landscape, so there were some growing pains in that way, but on the whole, the guy just was a superhero. He saved hundreds of lives a day, the world loved him and called him the Golden Guardian, but then World War Hulk and Dark Reign happened and turned everything on its head. So for the most part, during World War Hulk, the Sentry didn't actually do anything, and there were a few reasons for this. Number one, he was struggling with agoraphobia. This was something he had always been struggling with, but it was exacerbated by his circumstances as a superhero out in the world, because this was all rooted in the fear of using his powers and unleashing the Void. The world has a lot of problems, and solving them meant using his powers, but the more he used his powers, the more likely the Void was to come out. So he would just never use his powers. There were other superheroes, and without him using his powers or doing anything, he just stayed at home all the time, and then became afraid of the outside. The second reason for this was because the Hulk was one of his oldest friends, but the third reason, and probably the most important, was because he agreed with the Hulk. When the Illuminati had sent the Hulk away, it was done in a pretty shady way. They literally tricked him onto a nuclear-powered ship with a fake rescue mission, and then sent him a video apologizing while he was hurled into a gravity well. He was supposed to go to a peaceful world, but ended up on Sakaar, and then the events of Planet Hulk unfold. And so after Sakaar was liberated by the Hulk, the ship is sabotaged and it explodes, killing his new wife and unborn child, so the Hulk returns to Earth more pissed off than he's ever been. But as far as the Sentry was concerned, it was the consequences of the Illuminati catching up to them. The thing, though, is that it's one thing for the Hulk to put the hurt on the Illuminati, just to make them feel pain. It's another to make them fight to the death and then kill them if they refuse to do so. And that was when the Sentry got involved. The fight between the two is pretty crazy, though. Normally, the Sentry's energy is enough to calm the Hulk down, but being so pissed off meant the Hulk would just continually rampage across New York and probably destroy the world at some point. So when the Sentry arrives on the scene, all hell breaks loose. Even now, I don't think there's ever been a fight between the Hulk and anyone else on the same level as this fight with the Sentry. What made this so awesome was that it was actually the Sentry cutting loose for one of the only times in his entire life. In fact, he says that. He tells the Hulk that he's the only person who can take it. But by this point, New York had already been in shambles from everything that Hulk had done. And so this fight basically levels what's left. These guys are knocking each other into everything, knocking down apartment buildings, skyscrapers. The whole place is a war zone, and the Sentry has never had a better time fighting anybody. In fact, the shockwaves of their hits are knocking superheroes back and knocking down buildings. All anybody can really do is just watch. And it gets to the point where the amount of energy they're letting off becomes so extreme that they revert back into their human forms. Now, of course, Riddles passes out from the sheer exhaustion, and the rest of World War Hulk unfolds from there. But up until this point, it had always just been the Sentry trying to hold the Void off and oftentimes limiting the use of his power in order to keep that from happening. There's even a credible argument to be made there that that's what he was doing when he was fighting the Hulk. His marriage with Lindy was strained because she knew about his mental health issues and his past drug addiction, and it was a lot to deal with. But for the most part, the Void wasn't really a major player at this point in his life. The Sentry basically had it all under control. With Dark Reign, it was a whole new ballgame, because after the events of Secret Invasion, when the world learned that the Skrulls were secretly replacing superheroes, Norman Osborn intercepted information that ended the war. He ends up becoming the new director of S.H.I.E.L.D. after Tony Stark gets the boot, and then he replaces S.H.I.E.L.D. with Hammer, and he replaces the Avengers with the Dark Avengers, basically villains. Then he starts planning world domination. The problem with this is that as powerful as the Sentry was, there was no way that he would go along with a villain villain in taking over the world. So Osborn starts manipulating him. First, he gives Robert Reynolds a new version of the Sentry serum to earn his trust and then make him dependent. Then he convinces him that the Void just doesn't exist, that the Void was a delusion created by Reynolds. Now, initially, Reynolds has a hard time believing this, but Norman Osborn makes the argument that as someone who struggled with the Green Goblin persona, he's actually the best person to explain how multiple personalities work and understands Robert Reynolds better than anybody else could. And so with Reynolds on his side, the Sentry basically becomes Anakin Skywalker. He literally starts going around on all these hit missions for Osborn, taking out the sorceress Morgan Le Fay or massacring Atlanteans. It's all done in the name of quote-unquote national security. And while the Void slowly starts to creep back in, do you guys remember that scene from Revenge of the Sith when Padme confronts Anakin? Well, imagine she shoots him in the face when she realizes how evil he's become. And that's basically what happened here. The Sentry comes back home, and Lindy is so terrified of what he's turned into and the things he's done, she fires off a ray gun and blows his face apart. Immediately, the Void emerges and tries to kill Lindy, but the Sentry persona stops that from happening. Then the Sentry regains control and flies into space and tries to destroy himself in the sun, only to resurrect with the Void making a pretty compelling argument for Bob Reynolds that if the Sentry was capable of making the world better, it would be better already, and that the Void is willing to do what needs to be done in order to make that happen. It's messy and lives will be lost, but ultimately, greater good comes out of it. It's a pretty dark argument to make, but Sentry believes it, and he gives in. So the Void comes back to Earth and immediately confronts Osborn, knowing that Osborn had been manipulating Sentry the entire time. And initially the Void was going to kill Norman Osborn, but of course Osborn pleads like his life depends on it, because it does. The argument that Osborn makes is that yes, the Void could kill him, but superheroes would find a way to kill the Void. And there are ways to do it, right? Extreme levels of magic, artifacts like the Infinity Gauntlet or a Cosmic Cube. They could kill the Void under the right circumstances or any circumstance at all. And so instead, Osborn promises the Void the one thing he wants the most: a world without the Sentry, Robert Reynolds, and any other ties to it. And so a big issue here is that this entire conversation is happening at Avengers Tower, and Lindy overhears it all. And because Lindy is the Sentry's one link to the world, and as long as she's around, she'll spill the beans to the superheroes on what Osborn's planning. So Osborn brings in Bullseye. Now here's the thing to know about Bullseye. He only has one rule when it comes to contract kills. If the money's there, he doesn't care, and woe betide the poor soul who stiffs him on the check. So by this point, Bullseye was this new Hawkeye in Dark Avengers and basically had a license to kill. So when Osborn puts the hit on Lindy, Bullseye pulls it off. He tricks her into leaving the building under the guise that it's under attack and then puts her in a helicopter so they can transport her to a safe location. But mid-flight, Bullseye chokes her to death with his bare hands and then throws her out into the middle of the ocean. And then all hell breaks loose. The only place in the United States at this point in time that was outside of Osborn's sphere of control were Utopia, where the X-Men lived, and Asgard, which had been rebuilt in Broxton, Oklahoma, after the events of Ragnarok. And so Osborn wasn't stupid enough to attack the X-Men head-on, but Asgard was a much easier target. Technically, Osborn himself was being manipulated by Loki, who wanted to send the city of Asgard back to the actual Asgardian dimension, but it all amounts to the same thing. Because once Ares, the god of war, learns about the siege on Asgard, he turns against Osborn since he's being asked to kill his friends. And Osborn has the Void kill Ares by ripping him in half in front of God and all. It's a pretty horrifying thing to see, and it's the moment when Osborn and everyone starts to realize the idea of controlling the Void is an illusion at best. I mean, how do you control God? And so Captain America reforms the Avengers, who don't even care about being against registration anymore because this is way bigger than that, but none of it makes any difference because what follows is an absolute massacre. The entirety of Norman Osborn's forces, hundreds of superheroes operating under the Initiative, come flying into Asgard while Captain America amasses his entire side. The US government is watching all this unfold, believing that it's going to lead to the destruction of the United States and potentially the world, so they prepare nukes. While all this is going on, Norman Osborn gives the order to the Void to destroy Asgard. So the Void starts ripping through the entire building and destroys the entire kingdom, right? Destroys Asgard's castle. And so Loki, watching all this unfold, the destruction of Asgard, the superheroes being killed left and right, the Molecule Man being destroyed, Loki summons Nornstones and then uses them to magically enchant Captain America's team, giving them basically the power of Asgardians. The Void realizes what's going on and kills Loki on the spot. At that point, Norman Osborn flees. The entire situation is out of his control. Captain America and the Avengers catch up to him, and he tells them, I was the only one who could control him, but now I can't. Now he's out there. You guys have no idea what you've done. I was trying to save you from him. Because at that point, the Void takes total control over the Sentry and just emerges up like this angel of death and starts killing everything in sight. So Thor, in this moment of desperation, casts down this strike of lightning, which is not enough to kill the Void, but it is enough to force him to revert into the Robert Reynolds form. And Robert Reynolds begs for death. He literally tells Thor, if you do not kill me, the Void is going to kill you all. And so Thor grants him that. Thor gives Robert Reynolds a mercy killing. And so you would think that after all this death and destruction, the world would have learned to let sleeping dogs lie, right? Just let things be. Wrong. So to sidetrack from the Sentry for a second, there were these two kids called the Apocalypse Twins. They were the children of the former X-Man Archangel, and both were kidnapped by Kang. The idea was that Kang wanted to remove mutants from Earth, making it easier for him to conquer the planet at some future point in time. But simply teaching the children about the dangers of humanity was completely different from living it. So he would drop them into these universes where humanity had conquered or killed the mutant population, hoping they would develop a strong enough hatred for humans that they would lead mutants away from Earth in the present day. The problem was that the Apocalypse Twins grew to hate both humanity and Kang. So when they arrived in the present, it wasn't enough to destroy the human race and free mutants. Earth had to go to prevent Kang from ever coming into existence in the first place. So they instigate a series of acts designed to drive the Celestials to Earth in order to wipe out all life, and it all revolves around the life and the death seeds. So these are quite literally exactly what they sound like. The life seed is used by Celestials to create life on worlds, and the death seed is deposited into individuals where it drives them to eradicate weaker species so only stronger species can live. Apocalypse is an example of someone with the death seed, and it's why all those with the seed look more or less the same. But the first step was killing the next person to attain the death seed. The next step was taking the life and death seeds for themselves after killing a Celestial using Thor's battle axe Yarnbjorn, which had been enchanted to destroy Celestials. And the third step was to use the death seeds to resurrect specific individuals who could be used to destroy anyone opposing the Apocalypse Twins' plans. This is why they brought back the Sentry. He was just that damn powerful. In fact, he starts doing things that we hadn't seen him do before. During his fight with the Wasp, he starts controlling the ground around them, summoning these giant rock soldiers. He even rips his head open after it's blasted by Wasp just to show her how powerless she is against him. It's literally just a brain and eyeballs attached by nerve endings. Now Thor shows up, but the fight doesn't last very long. If anything, it's a distraction because in the middle of it, Exitar the Executioner shows up, planning to destroy the entirety of Earth, which he does. Fortunately, Kang intervenes, and he sends the minds of the Avengers into their past selves, which had the benefit of both giving Thor the opportunity to speak with Sentry and reveal the true plans of the Apocalypse Twins in destroying Earth, and allow the superheroes of Earth alongside the Sentry to prepare for the arrival of Exitar and then destroy him when he shows up, which they do. And then Null kills him, and it was probably the quickest fight that Sentry had ever been in. So Null was the creator of the symbiotes with a vendetta against the Celestials. He was a product of the space between universes, and it has different names, the Yawning Void or the Great Darkness. But the Celestials had sparked a war with Null when they began creating light and life in the universe while Null was occupying it. And while Null was defeated, he learned to harness the All Black, which is quite literally living darkness, oftentimes referred to as the living abyss. But Null used it to create the symbiotes as part of his war against all gods across the universe, and while he was eventually defeated by the symbiotes that he created, he eventually shows up on Earth having already defeated the Celestials, and then Sentry goes to fight them. Sentry does defeat one of the Celestials, and then he flies Null into space with the intention of tearing him in half, only for Null to kill Sentry on the spot, and then absorb the void into its very essence, making Null even more powerful than he was before. But following that, the Sentry hasn't really appeared that much. He showed up for a moment in the Jane Valkyrie comics and kind of talked to her about the idea of going on to the afterlife and things that he'd done. But since then, Marvel had actually introduced new versions of the Sentry with people who gained his powers. They gained fractions of his powers, but his powers nonetheless. It's not that great. It's interesting, but it's not that great. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.